네, 안녕하십니까.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. And again, this is Yun-Chang-shik of KF. The 2022 KF Global Korean Studies Forum is fully compliant with COVID control measures and in a hybrid format for those of you joining us online. Thank you once again for joining us. Let us start the first session on the progress and prospects in Korean studies by region. From Korea, the US, Americas, Europe, we have professors leading research and promotion of Korean studies from around the world ready for this session. And there is one announcement. Professor Balderrama from the Autonomous University of Nuevo Leon is unable to join us due to his COVID. We wish Professor Balderrama to get well soon. This session will be moderated by Professor Kim Seung-kyung of Indiana University, Bloomington. Professor Kim is the director of the Institute for Korean Studies and a professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. Professor Kim, you have the floor.
Thanks for the introduction, Dr. Yoon. Good morning, everyone. 안녕하세요, 여러분. 반갑습니다. As he said, my name is Seung-kyung Kim. I've been teaching in the U.S. over 30 years, starting in 1990, and have witnessed the rapid growth of Korean studies during this time. This expansion has a lot to do with the Korea Foundation's vision that was pointed out by Professor Duncan earlier. And as you can see from my affiliation, I am also one of the beneficiaries of these Korea Foundation endowed chairs. So it is really my honor to moderate this first session of the 2022 Korea Foundation Global Korean Studies Forum. The session's theme is Progress and Prospects of Korean Studies in Different Regions of the World. I am going to introduce all the speakers now, and because everyone you have all the programs there, and our bios are included in that program. So in order to save time for us to present and discuss later, I am not going to tell you about their bios. So you can refer to the program. Please do so. From my left, Professor Jisu Kim from the George Washington University. Professor Clark Sorensen from the University of Washington. Professor Eunjung Lee from the Free University in Berlin. Professor Won Jung Min from the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. Professor Young Juju from the University of Michigan. Professor Robert Oppenheim from the University of Texas, Austin. Professor Miriam Lobensteinova from the Charles University in Prague. And Professor Antonio Fiori from the University of Bologna. Please join me in thanking them first. And after this applause, please hold your applause until everybody has presented. So we have 4 Korean studies professors from North America, Europe, and Latin America presenting on this topic. And these presentations will be followed by 4 designated discussants from the same regions. We have until 12:10, but we also have 8 speakers, as you can see. So I would like to ask the presenters and discussants to please keep to their allotted times. And you will see that from the podium. And I am going to start right away. The first presenter is Professor Jisu Kim. She will present progress.
김지수 교수님께서는 북미 인문학 중심으로 한국학의 발전과 전망에 대해서 발표.
All right, thank you. Good morning. I would like to first congratulate Korea Foundation's 30th anniversary and thank the organizers of this forum for inviting me to speak at this panel along with esteemed colleagues. The Korea Foundation has been critical in the development of Korean studies in the world, as Professor Duncan mentioned, and I'm also a beneficiary of the Korea Foundation. I hold the Korea Foundation endowed position at George Washington University. We have 3 endowed positions, and one of them is mine in the history department, and the others are in the political science and East Asian languages and literatures, Korean literature. It's so exciting to see Korean studies faculty from all over the world, literally all over the world at this forum today. 11 years ago, at the 20th anniversary Korea Foundation Assembly, I think it was called Assembly back then, I had just begun my career at George Washington University as an assistant professor. And I don't know whether Professor Clark Sorensen remembers, but I was a rapporteur of his panel session back then. So I am very honored and humbled to be speaking about Korean studies with senior colleagues who have contributed to the field much longer period and have more in-depth knowledge than I do. So today I will share my thoughts about Korean studies as a mid-career scholar who have devoted last several years in building the Korean studies program at my own institution and more broadly participated in the field in a variety of ways. I'll try to be brief. So I was asked to talk about humanities in North America at this panel, so I'll be focusing on the humanities, and Professor Sorensen will focus more broadly on social sciences and Korean studies more broadly. So I would like to first begin with a terminology issue and then move on to the importance of diversity and inclusion, state of the field because I thought I had 15 minutes, but I have 13 minutes, so I think I will be very brief in mentioning state of the field and then give my final comments about my thoughts on future of Korean studies. First, I would like to begin with this terminology issue. Well, so at the 20th anniversary assembly, I remember discussing what Korean studies was back then. I don't think we have a consensus on what it is. Perhaps we'll never have that consensus since it is not a fixed concept that's it is constantly changing and depending on the context of the field. So the Korean studies field has been continuously growing, and it's not something we can easily define. We'll still be discussing this, I think, probably maybe 10 years from now. And it may even be meaningless to define what it is as the field continues to grow and change. Although it is difficult to define, I think one thing is clear, that the field should be understood broadly as possible, and that it is certainly not an isolated field. When a scholar is regarded as a Koreanist, it's mostly dependent on, I think, on her or his language ability to conduct research in Korean. And there's no question that language training is extremely, extremely important, as Professor Duncan mentioned. But does this mean we should exclude research based on methodology and frameworks? So there are some scholars in the field who think that even without language, depending on what field you're in, and especially in an interdisciplinary field, it is possible to produce scholarship. So many scholars are using Korea, quote-unquote Korea, as a site of their research inquiry. And I think it would be too limiting to use language as the only marker to define who are Korean studies scholars in the current scholarly environment. And I think we should lead the field to be more inclusive than exclusive. And I'll discuss more about this inclusivity later. I would like to begin with this terminology issue before getting into further discussion about the field. And I would like to point out the gap that we find in Korean and English when we refer to Korean studies. So we translate Korean studies as 한국학 in Korean. And in South Korea, they distinguish 한국학 and 북한학. And literal translation would be South Korean studies, North Korean studies, 한국학, 북한학. And in North America, when we use Korean studies, it includes Korea until 1948 and the two Koreas until present, contemporary. And research on North Korea continuously increased in the last several decades. And last year, the Journal of Korean Studies, which I'm the editor and running the journal now, we published a special issue guest edited by Greg Brzezinski on researching North Korea, methods, frameworks, and sources. And this issue was to help junior scholars conducting research on North Korea to gain insights on how scholars have creatively studied North Korea despite challenges that they cannot travel to the country. So when we had this workshop for this special issue, some scholars of North Korea raised issues about the word 한국학 because the word is limited to the south, and they are also uncomfortable with using 북한학 because it does not appropriately represent their research. And their research is not isolated from Korean studies, obviously, but the Korean word 한국학 seems to be somewhat limiting. So with the growth of scholarship on North Korea in North America, I think it's worth considering how we are using the terms Korean studies and 한국학 and what's lost in translation. Is there any gap in these two words in English and Korean? I don't have an answer to that. Of course, I don't know what's an alternative. But in my talk today, I want to emphasize that the field should be more inclusive than exclusive. I think that's the point that I would like to make. And this means we have to be more careful with our usage of terms and also how we use them. And this leads me to my second point, to diversify the field both in terms of contents and personnel. So now I would like to discuss about the importance of diversity and inclusion in Korean studies. So in order to raise Korean studies to the next level, I think it is critical to strengthen diversity and inclusion in the field of Korean studies. Enhancing diversity through students, scholars from different races, ethnicities, and social backgrounds is extremely crucial in strengthening the field by asking different questions and bringing diverse perspectives. And to deepen the reach of Korean studies, we must cultivate next generation of Korean studies experts to enhance diversity. And I would like to briefly share GW's example of enhancing diversity and inclusion in its effort to expand the inclusivity and diversity of the Asian studies field. GWIX, or we go by GWIX, GW Institute for Korean Studies, and the GW East Asia National Resource Center have developed a cornerstone partnership with Spelman College, which is a historically black liberal arts college for women in Atlanta, Georgia. Founded in 1881, Spelman College is currently a global leader in the education of women of African descent. And Spelman College has a robust Asian studies program with minors in Asian studies, Chinese studies, Japanese studies. But they lack Korean studies. They don't have Korean studies. Despite its strong foundation in Asian studies, Spelman College does not have sufficient resources to offer a Korean studies minor or Korea-focused opportunities to students. So my impression is that interest in Korean studies at Spelman College is strong, but they do not have resources. So through our collaborative partnership, GWIX and NRC have been crucial partners in aiding the growth and development of Korean studies at Spelman College. And GWIX and NRC have facilitated guest lectures for Spelman students on Korea-related topics and have taken Spelman students and faculty to visit the Korean Cultural Center in Washington, D.C. So we invite Spelman students who are interested in Asian studies to Washington, D.C. and run their professional development program in which we educate them about China, Korea, and Japan. So at our institute, we have been offering opportunities for Spelman students to participate in our undergraduate research fellows program, which supports students to write research papers on Korea, and a summer study abroad program. Actually, our summer study abroad program began this Monday, and they're here in this room back over there. And there are 6 GW students and 3 Spelman students participating this year. In the afternoon, they will be going to Seonggyunkwande to listen to lectures and learn more about Korean studies. So these students, actually, through these kind of programs, one of the students who participated in the NRC program in the past, maybe I think 2-3 years ago, she's currently an MA student at Georgetown University studying, and she has shown interest in Korean linguistics. So I think this kind of programs really encourage students to be able to pursue further studies. Spark their interest and then pursue further studies related to Korea. It is important to invest in graduate programs in Korean studies, and I think until now, most of investments have been focused on focus at the graduate level, but I think it is equally vital to support students at undergraduate level to raise their interest that could lead them to pursue their career in either academic or practical fields related to Korea. In addition to students who are being trained to become scholars in the field of Korean studies, many students pursue careers in the public sector, think tanks, NGOs, international organizations, and so forth. And so it is important that we educate these students who will not only potentially become academic scholars, but also Korea experts who can shape in a variety of fields in North America. Wow, I only have less than 3 minutes. Okay, okay, I will skip and I will just get into future of Korean studies because I think I do need to. I'll skip the state of the field. I think Professor Duncan had really given this overview of, but I just wanted to mention digital humanities is also one of the rising fields. Although there's a handful of scholars right now, I think there should be more. So hopefully there will be more graduate students interested in digital humanities. And then just one last thing, Korean American studies. This is also something, I mean, Asian studies and Asian American studies, there's been always, tension as to whether, in defining identity of scholars. And I think this also applies to scholars working on Korean American studies. But as I said at the beginning, I think my take is to be more inclusive than exclusive, and obviously I think these scholars who are producing scholarship related to diaspora, immigration, migration, they should all be included as part of Korean studies scholars, although they may not see themselves as Korean studies scholars, but I think when it comes to including Korean studies scholarship, we should definitely include them. Okay, final future of Korean studies. So Korea is not a fixed identity. I think it continues to be defined, redefined, negotiated. And so when conducting Korea as a site of research, I think it can mean various things, and the field should be more inclusive than exclusive. I'll just give one example. So Latin American, so for example, I was serving on a Latin American history search for my department, and there was this applicant who was a Latin Americanist, but was focusing research on North Korea, so its relationship with North Korea during the Cold War. So then how do we, what are some of the ways that we can be more inclusive than and my other colleagues thought he was definitely, of course, Latin Americanist, but then I think there's also that, his research area focuses on North Korea, then I think there's also that kind of, interdisciplinary fields which he's able to bring in, and also for me, he would also be also potentially could be Korean studies scholar as well. So my my time has ended, but I think I would just like to mention. There's language and Hallyu issues and all that, but I'll just skip and I'll just make one final comment saying that, of course, institutional and funding issue is very, very critical in continuing to develop Korean studies. But I think, as we've heard, Korea Foundation have contributed tremendously in creating all these endowed professorships in North America and throughout the world. And I think in North America now, I think Korean studies scholars should really also target not just Korean studies positions, but more broadly East Asia positions or cybersecurity. So for example, like one of our students who wrote a dissertation in North Korean history, and he ended up getting a position for the cybersecurity position. So I think we should really try to reach out beyond Korean studies in order to expand and continue to grow in the future. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kim. When you start, the time just ticks. So, as I said, please keep to your time. Make it accordingly. That's what's important. But the issues that she just raised, diversity and inclusion issues, those two are very, very important issues, not just in Korean studies, but especially in East Asian studies field, we talk a lot about that and the importance of how to recruit and train those young students into making them scholars of Korean studies or East Asian studies, coming from minority and underrepresented population in the US. And that issue will be with us for quite a while, and we will have to address that. Now we are going to the second presenter, Professor Clark Sorensen.
Hello. I want to echo all of the previous presenters in thanking the Korea Foundation for organizing this meeting, and also thanking the Korea Foundation for their long-term support for Korean studies around the world that has really made a big difference in the development of the field. So the topic I was given is progress and prospects of Korean studies in the Western U.S. So I'll go right into it. A lot of what I'm going to say, echoes what John Duncan said. I think John and I are probably the two oldest people here today, so we have the longest experience. I suppose that would. So when we talk about people of John and my generation, this generation is about to retire. We have to be replaced. And I've called us the 782 or 782 generation because we got our PhDs in the 1970s or maybe a little bit later. We got jobs in the 1980s, and then we built programs at our university in the 2000s. So John and I are kind of the second generation of Korean studies in the United States. The first generation were people like Gary Ledger, Jim Palais, my mind's not operating quite well, but there were others as well. And so we were students of them. So we had the benefit of learning from bona fide Korean scholars. So that's the characteristics of us. But there was also a political context in which we were trained. So Korean studies was closely related to area studies, which was something that developed because the United States had a need for expertise in places around the world corresponding to its expanding global role in the world after World War II. Now, I'm not saying that all of the scholars in Korean studies were political in that way, but the structures that supported us, the graduate programs that were created, and so forth were a result of that point of view. So this research was historically contingent. We also encountered Korea in the 1960s and the 1970s. And of course, that was the Yushin period when Park Chung-hee was in power. And so on the one hand, you had a very dynamic economy that was growing very, very rapidly. But you also had an authoritarian regime with human rights issues. And so that created a dilemma for those of us who were studying Korea. On the one hand, we were sympathetic to what was happening in Korea, but we also saw people who were suffering because of the political situation. So it gave us what I've called a critical but sympathetic orientation to Korea in Korean studies. So Koreans often in those days were uncomfortable with the way we treated Korea because they wanted uncritical admiration for Korean society and culture, and we weren't willing to do that, but it's not because we didn't feel very sympathetic to the Korean people. So that's a characteristic of this 782 research, I think. For all of us in this period, finding academic work was very, very difficult. Of the people I know who got PhDs during that period, probably only 1/3 or maybe less actually got academic jobs because there were only 4 universities who were regularly producing PhDs. I think John Duncan's already mentioned that, Harvard, Columbia, University of Washington, Hawaii. And then later on, UCLA came online. So there were very few places to get jobs. So how's the field changed? Well, a lot of the change has been brought about by the Korea Foundation itself. There are many more universities with well-established Korea Studies programs in the United States. Speaking of the Western U.S. and Canada, I could enlist Hawaii, 3 or 4 University of California campuses, Stanford, University of Washington, University of British Columbia, Brigham Young, Claremont McKenna College, the list goes on. So there's quite a large number of programs, and Korea Foundation support was critical in establishing these programs. So I want to really congratulate the Korea Foundation for doing that. It's really helped Korean studies. So today, we get a wide variety of studies and approaches, and this is a big change. Scholars are free to do focused research now. When I was entering the field, we felt that we had to do foundational research. There was hardly anything published on Korea in English, and whatever we had to do the foundational work. We couldn't really rely on there being an existing discourse on Korea because there really wasn't an existing discourse. And so for me, and I think probably for John and other people from our generation, finding a topic that was significant for Korea, but which could also interest other people, that is non-Korea specialists in the United States, was a big problem. My field is anthropology. There was maybe one good ethnography on Korea that was out. There was no discourse on Korean society or culture. And I would have to publish in anthropology journals. I would have to publish with presses that had anthropology lists. And so I had to appeal to anthropologists, 99% of whom cared nothing about Korea. And so how to create a discourse about Korea that would interest these people was a big problem for me, and not just me. It was really a problem for everybody in Korean studies in those days. Now, this foundational research is already done. There are books out there that people can read. They can get interested in topics. They can do much more focused research than we could. And so you can do a quite focused topic and then use the English language literature to contextualize your work. So that means we're getting a great wide variety of studies and approaches now. So I was thinking of the books that I read in the past few years. In anthropology, I'm the only one, I think, that continued to focus on rural Korea. So everything is urban anthropology now, or specialized political studies of politics, cultural movements, and so forth. In history, there's a great variety of studies, although, as John has mentioned, pre-modern history is not getting the attention that it deserves. In social sciences, we get studies of party politics, gender, international migration, and marriage and labor issues. And I'll leave the humanities because Jisu has already talked about that. One of the new things is the breakdown of the walls between Korean studies and Korean American studies. So if you go back 20 or 30 years ago, Korean American studies was focused in sociology departments, and there was a tradition in the United States of how you study immigrant groups, and it was all about how this immigrant group adapted, how did that immigrant group adapt, which was more successful, which was least successful, and this is where the origin of the model minority idea about Koreans came, and it's something that young Korean Americans are fighting against, although when you think of the alternatives, maybe it's not such a bad model to have. So now Korean studies and Korean American studies are not so sharply separated anymore, because the people who do Korean American studies, well, Korean Americans are moving back and forth between Korea and America, so you can't talk about Korean American studies without talking about Korea. You can't talk about Korean studies without talking about the Korean diasporas. So that's one reason why this past artificial distinction between Korean studies and Korean American studies has faded away. So that's an important trend. And nowadays, there's just a big interest in Korea. And it's not just because of Hallyu, it's because of Korean development, it's because of Korean culture, it's because of Korean movies, it's because of Korean song. And I was thinking as I was watching the television the other day, you know, Korean pop music is still melodic, whereas American pop music has all gone rap, and it's got great rhythm and it's got great lyrics, but melody, it's gone. And so maybe that's one of the reasons why K-pop is so popular. Of course, we all know the other reason as well. So also the number of students and their ethnic background that I get is very, very diverse now. So when I first started out, all of my students were white. Then later on, I got Korean American students. Maybe half of my students were Korean American. But now my students are everything. They're white, they're Korean American, they're Chinese overseas students, they're Japanese, Filipino. I get Somali students in my class, Latin students, Middle Eastern, you name it. They're all interested in Korea. So there's a wide variety of people. So I'm getting toward the end, and here's my conclusion. So I'm not doing too bad. So Korean studies is firmly established in the US and Canada, but finding scholarly jobs is still difficult for everybody. But a wide variety of students are interested in Korea. The problems that I see are that academic administrators are less interested in specialized topics in the humanities and social sciences, and there's been a big focus on STEM fields, STEM, the science, technology fields. And also the old area studies paradigm is breaking down. And while there may be some benefits, that one of the drawbacks is that students no longer have time to learn adequate language before they go into their field. There's no way somebody who starts a PhD program in sociology without good Korean language is going to learn Korean well enough in order to do original language research. So the shortening of the time periods that John Duncan talked about, the absence of venues for people who are not of Korean or Korean American background, who already know the language, to put the time it takes to learn Korean language, and it takes more than 4 years to bring your Korean language up to the level where you can actually do research with it if you're not a heritage speaker. So that's the biggest problem that I see now. And I'll leave 20 seconds free. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Sorensen. You know, he talked very briefly about the 782 generation and their contribution. But we have been facing the retirements of this 782 generation for some time now in the US. And we realize over and over again how much they have helped establishing Korean studies and training crucial cohorts of scholars who are now very active in the US. So thank you for that. The third presenter is Professor Eunjung Lee from the Free University in Berlin, and she is going to talk about Korean studies in Europe, progress and challenge.
네, 안녕하세요. 저는
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to speak in Korean.
먼저 유럽에서 트레이닝을 받은
First of all, as a scholar trained in Europe, there is a habit that's very difficult to break in Europe, which is being overly critical. So before I engage in any critical recollection, I would like to maybe go into the current status of Europe to maybe maybe focus on some of the positive aspects of the current state in Europe, and then move on to the critical recollection of the situation in Europe. As you know, all of the universities in Europe and the Korean studies departments in European universities and colleges are increasing, and you can see that they basically have no empty seats. Sometimes it would be 300 and 400 students majoring in Korean studies, and you can see that this is a situation which was unimaginable for such universities and universities where there are more than 300 plus students majoring in Korean studies in undergraduate courses. And the universities actually boast that they are the hub of Korean studies, but then at the end of the day, if you look at the number of students, I guess there are more than 30 to 40 universities that can call themselves the hub of Korean studies. And if you look at the number of faculty, we've been seeing an increased number of faculty, and the Korea Foundation, I know, has contributed greatly to increasing the professorships in these universities and colleges. So I would like to pay my gratitude and tribute to KF. But there is a difference in terms of the universities in the European continent. If you look at the European continent universities, they do have Korean studies that's in the form of area studies focused on humanities. So there is not much, if you do not have enough language study courses or language proficiency during your undergraduate years, it's very difficult to actually go into that field of Korean studies. So it gets more hardcore. And in the undergraduate course, they enter into the university as a Korean study major. You can see that there is a difference of taking that track and those that go right into the graduate studies. Typically, if we think about Korean studies, you may only think about the North Korean scholarship. However, I do want to mention that Europe has a longer traditional history in Korean studies, and I want to mention that it started off with its roots in humanities. If you look at the US in the 20th century, it did focus on social sciences or area studies. However, in the case of the traditional European Korean studies, their roots are different. And within Europe, there are various Korean studies related networks. So I know that you all know that we have Axel, and in addition to the Association of Korean Studies, we have both South and North Europe and the UK and relevant European countries. There are Association Korean Studies, also Asian Korean Studies Association. So there are various associations that exist in Europe. So in 2005 and 2016, if you refer to the Overseas Korean Studies report, you will be able to understand that there are major changes. And if you look at the current state of Korean studies, it's not that bad from decades ago. So then, let me now move on to the essence of my presentation. So since when did we see the emergence of Korean studies in Europe? And how did it develop throughout the years? And what kind of challenges exist, in my view? So first, Korean studies in Europe. Before we go into Korean studies, research or interest in Korea started off with Hamel. However, I believe that there is a specific Hamel type of philosophy that is in place, but I think that that is too static. And I believe that this has to be criticized, and maybe we can talk about this during the discussion session. But I want to mention that Hamel had a very negative experience in Korea, so he has a very negative perception towards Korea. However, if you look at the World History Encyclopedia, you can see that there are some analytical work on Korea. And who made this? It was Katterer, an historian that actually put together this book on world history. And there is a Korean part that consists of 50 pages, and the reason why he was able to do that was because from 1734 and the onward 40 years, there was a description of China by Juju. That was the basis of Gatterer's Universal History book. But this description of China actually is based off on the missionaries that worked in China. But if you think about universal history, if you look at the report, there are cases when there are negative connotations on Korea, like Hamill's book, but then we also have some positive connotations that is indicated by the work and records of the missionaries or the Jesuit missionaries that believe that Korea has very high moral standards. So I do want to mention that as scholars we need to take into both. But if you look at the Universal History book of Gatterer, what's important here is, well, starting from Juhel's description of China, if you look at universal history of Gatterer, how is Korea categorized is key. So if you look at the description of China or any other records, China and Japan are separated out as a intellectual discipline or categories, and the two studies are comparable. However, if you look at Korea, it's actually part of Chinese studies with Tibet, for instance. So it's indicated as a marginal Chinese area. So that was end of 18th century. In the intellectual taxonomy of Europe, that was the position of Korea. And it was very difficult for Korea to break away from that. But coincidentally, that was a time when Asian studies started to lay root in Europe. And Oriental studies, of course, lay root at the time. However, it was mostly Chinese studies and Japanese studies. And in the case of Germany, and especially in the area where I reside, Berlin, actually has more than 100 plus years of history in Chinese and Japanese studies. But if you look at the Oriental studies, there really wasn't any room or courses on Korean studies. And what was the reason behind that? Already, Korea, from the 18th century, it was included as a marginal region of China, and therefore Korea was indicated as a third region or a colony. However, in 1904, these are the motives on Korea, and you can see that these motives or ads at that time, Korea is indicated as a colony, like Africa, as an exotic nation. And I believe that the European intellects hold on to such perception of Korea. And in the 20th century, in the European university, we've seen Korean studies departments being installed. And if you look at these Korean studies courses, the image that European intellects had, how much did that change? Well, we'll have to review that. But these Korean language courses and Korean studies departments started to get established in universities after World War II. So it's 1953. So from the Prague Charles University, that was they've actually started that first, and in 1946 in Western Europe from Leiden University of the Netherlands. And you can see that in München University there was a language course that was established, but not a Korean studies course as of yet. So in the 70s and 80s, you can see that there were certain handful of universities that started with building or establishing Korean studies courses, and then it was SOAS of the UK, based on the funding from KF, that has actually established professorships on Korean studies. So if you look at the development path, in the early 1980s at AXE, if you refer to this report, there were 3 professors of Korean studies in 5 universities, and in 2001 there were 14 universities with 5 professors in Korean studies. And in 2014, you can see that there was an exponential growth of 30 universities and with a faculty of more than 20 in Korean studies. And in 2022, just in Germany alone, tenured professorships of Korean studies amount to 9 in 6 universities. That's quite a lot. And half of that, actually, of those professors or professorships have been financed and supported by KF. So this is what I really wanted to mention. So in Korean studies, of course, we've been seeing an expansion in quantity. So what about the qualitative growth of Korean studies? In the 80s, if you look at Japanese studies, there was this say within Europe that because it was based on traditional humanities, Japanese studies, of course, lay root in that. So they thought that we may have to switch and transition into a social science type of discourse. And in the 90s, there was a similar movement to switch to a social science perspective. And you can see that in Europe, if you look at area studies, it actually is a two-pronged approach of both humanities and social sciences. So then what about Korean studies? You can see that the recent professorships have been filled by those that were bred and grown in Korea and are social scientists. So you can see that there really wasn't much thought given into the methodology or process, but then all of a sudden there was this switch or change in the direction or the angle of Korean studies. But if we look at these scholars, social scientists that have been trained, born in Korea, trained in the US, and then filling these seats in Europe, it seems as if Europe is becoming the Galapagos of Korean studies because, as mentioned, it seems to go against the humanitarian roots of Europe. It seems to just take, the professorships seem to take advantage of Europe. So for them, they can stay, they can study, and they can leave. But what should we do about the Korean studies that remain or the remnants of their current studies? So then it's important to see the reason of existence of Korean studies in Europe. You can see that we have the European Research Council, the German Research Council. There are many support towards Korean studies. And are there many Korea-related research projects in earnest? Well, not necessarily. And if you look at the European journals, there are many dissertations on Korean studies. And also in terms of disciplinary, multidisciplinary studies or interdisciplinary studies, are there many faculty from Korean studies that actually take part? But unfortunately, we do not have as an active participation as of yet. So at the end of the day, education is about looking down 100 years down the road. If we want Korean studies to go down that path of centuries, in the mid to long run, what should we do? If we really want to boost and develop Korean studies in Europe, what kind of faculty would be necessary? What kind of professors and scholars? And how will they be training the next generation? How will we be able to nurture these students in Europe and bring them together into an integrated discipline? Because if you look at the Europe, we're not training expats. You can see that all of these students are Germans, or Turkish living in Germany, or Vietnamese that were born in Germany. So we have no Korean or let's say anyone from the Korean diaspora. They are true Germans or Europeans. So you can see that for those that were that grew up in Germany, scholars that grew up in America, and for those that were born in Europe and that continue on with their scholarly endeavors, how are we going to find a way to harmonize the work from all of these different type of streams of scholars? So then, what kind of challenges exist for Europe's Korean studies in the 21st area studies domain? We actually engage in studies in Korean as well as Chinese characters. So I think that it's about how we can find a way to hone expertise on Korean language and Chinese characters because it's the basis. And there are also other disciplines that study Korea. So how are we going to maintain or build a relationship with them? And then also the members of the press. In many cases in Europe, they have a misunderstanding of Korea. And then what happens is in the museums, for instance, Korea maybe exhibited in a wrongful fashion. So I think that it's really important to make sure that the scholars of Korean studies really need to find a way to correct that. So then, I have, and they do say that Korean studies is not about promoting Korea, but then because it is Korean studies in the regional community of Berlin, I think that I do have to play a pivotal role in promoting Korea. So it's not because I'm in Berlin, but in Europe, for all of the Korean studies departments probably would be faced with such challenges. With that, let me conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee. What she talked about, there are lots and lots of issues that you brought up, which is not, I hope we have a chance to discuss some of those and the issues that facing Europe and the issues that facing North America. There are some issues that are overlapping, but there are some issues that weigh in different ways. And I hope after we present, the time that we have left with the audience and presenters here have a fruitful discussion on those issues. Thank you. The last presenter is Professor Won Jung-min, and she will present Progress and Prospects of Korean Studies in Central and South America.
감사합니다. Buenos días. 안녕하십니까?
Thank you for the introduction. Good morning. I have lived in Chile since 2004 and has received the endowment from Korean forums for more than 10 years to train students in Korean studies and also publishing articles on Korean studies. So thank you to KF, and I'd like to thank the Asian Studies Center at SNU for helping me prepare this PowerPoint. I have studied at the SNU from 2020 as a Kyujangak Fellow at the SNU, and before that I was with the Pontifical Catholic University, and I have taught many Latin American students in Korean studies. So the area of my focus was online, offline, and between Chile and Korea about how they look at Korea and how Koreans look at Latin America. Everyone says that regional studies is important and quantitative growth is important, but not much about who does what, why, and how. So the Latin America we speak of consists of 33 countries. Mexico shares borders with the US and all the way down to the Caribbean. All these countries are included in Latin America. And as Professor Kim has mentioned, there's great interest in North Korea. There are countries in this region that only have diplomatic relations with North Korea or only with South Korea or both. And many people cannot tell North Korea from South Korea. And in many cases, Koreans are mistook for Chinese. So if we ask who is doing what and why and how, we do see numbers about who is doing what and how many activities are taking place, but it's not easy for us to see how hard people are working and how well the results are being produced. I have been with Costa Rica, Brazil, in many countries. I've met with colleagues in the Society of Korean Studies there. They are good friends, but sometimes good friends can form a cartel unwillingly, and we just stick on the narrow field of research that we only have. And in 2016, Uruguay, Mexico, Colegio de Mexico, Costa Rica, I visited all these places and found that Korean studies have been in Latin America for 30 plus years, but they were still talking about how to develop Korean studies in their countries. I think we should move away from the topic of developing Korean studies, and I wondered when that could happen, and these are some of the photos. So when we all have this discussion, just very succinctly, based on my experience, and the area I'm familiar with is Chile and Latin America. So thinking of Korean studies in Latin America, of course, Hallyu and all that is boosting interest in Korea in the region, but not to the extent that we can really shout out exclamations. And Korean studies has reached a level of going beyond thinking about how to simply develop Korean studies quantitatively. It is important to develop talents in Korean studies and how to train them to make contributions in the society. We focused on Korean studies or Korean studies centers in a regional-based way, or we have to also think of how to build a network about different students that are scattered across the world and this region. But the simple way forward is the former. Opening a Korean studies department or a Korean studies center in universities. But by nature, Latin American universities are not very easy places to do that. And unlike East Asian studies, Korean language education or Korean studies department are not directly linked to jobs. So when we lay such foundations, it's very difficult to link that investment into tangible results. Japanese interpretation and translation department was set up in one university in Latin America thanks to the success of anime and films. But these students, these majors, have a hard time finding jobs. And when you set up a center or Korean department, who teaches what and how is a big challenge. And if we open professorships in Korean studies departments here, we have very few Spanish-speaking and well-trained faculty. So do we need to compromise, or do we need to find the rare but very good talents? And we have to think of whether we are going to focus on research or education and what the meaning of research and education are. And if we all study Korean studies, I don't think that everyone who studies Korean studies should become professors. So elitism may not be a comfortable topic for us, but if we consider the Latin American region, we need to develop Korean studies into an elite area of studies so that students who are interested in pursuing a profession in the academics can be trained. Sociology students were writing an article in Hallyu, and I was invited as a second leader for instructing these students. You might think that writing articles for a BA is not important, but very few students move on to college in this region. So writing a thesis for BA is very important here. But finding the right talent is not easy. In this region, the government or embassies led the way in Korean studies development. Of course, the support is essential, but that is not enough. So I think that Korean studies in Latin America must continue to discover new students in different departments who are interested in Korean, who can write articles on Korea in the undergraduate and graduate courses. We need to develop them so that they can pool their own networks amongst themselves. And this must not be led by the embassy, but a bottoms-up way with needed support provided by these embassies. And for sustainability and voluntary and naturally sprung nature of such network is key, so that these students can become politicians, educators, and more, contributing to the society and also building a society-wide network. And that is the way forward for Korean studies in Latin America. Some say that even teaching Korean studies at all in Latin America is a big contribution, but I want more. I want to teach Korean studies well and do it right with a longer perspective and encourage students to really become great scholars and great career pursuers. We believe that Latin America is too far. We don't know about the region. And we think of Latin America as a single group, but we need to take a closer look with a longer perspective and consider the nature of this region I don't think that Korean language should be the major for all the students in Korean studies, because if Korean language is essential, then we can help the students learn Korean, but it's important for the students to have a good understanding of Korea and help make contribution to the society. And we need to form a network of talents, and that is very encouraging in nature. And I think such a Korean studies will be an important part of public diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Min. As you have already seen, we have 4 presenters from North America, Europe, and Latin America. And as you must have heard, the issues facing these different parts of the world are very different. Then how do we, again, approach these issues to make it possible for those who are living in these different parts of the world to learn about Korean studies and to be familiar with the Korean studies and to go out of the school and to go into the society and work as a person who is knowledgeable about Korea. And they can be in any different kinds of profession. Again, you just pointed out, not everybody will go into academia. There will be very, very small number of people who will go into. Then what do we do? How do we train this generation, young generation, to make it possible what we are trying to do and what Korea Foundation has been trying to do over the past 30 years? Please join me in thanking 4 presenters. So now we will move on to the designated discussants. Each discussant will have about 9 minutes, I think. So first one will be Professor Juju from the University of Michigan.
So thank you for the great honor. Thank you to Korea Foundation and President Gun Lee for the honor of being able to comment on these rich presentations. Also want to thank 윤창식 부장님 and 하보미 대리님 who made the event possible on a more micro level. So in the interest of time, my job is to comment on North American Korean studies. And I would like to focus on just one key word from each of the 2 presentations and try to link these 2 keywords into a deeper reflection about the present, past, and future of Korean studies in North America. From Professor Sorensen's presentation, that keyword for me is generation. 782 generation, which is also the 2nd generation, he said, of Korean studies scholars in the US and Canada. As a PhD from UCLA, whose advisor, Professor Peter H. Lee, born in 1929, was one of the first generation of Korean studies scholars, I believe. I'd like to mention that generation probably is not just an age category, but to the extent that generation marks a shared outlook, that in many ways, despite the immense amount of contribution and great scholarship of the so-called first-generation scholars like Professor Peter Lee, like Professor James Pillay of Washington, like Professor Ed Wagner of Harvard and Don Baker of UBC. The shared outlook part of it, which strikingly Professor Sorensen mentioned as sympathetic yet critical orientation to Korea, for me, that outlook confers on what he called the 782 generation, really the quality of the first generation. So if the earlier scholars were pioneers, here really was the first generation of Korean study scholars in North America. And I feel very privileged to have learned from them, including, of course, Professor John Duncan. This 782 generation, to my mind, was marked by 2 characteristics. One was an ambivalent relationship to governments, both American and South Korean. American government in the sense that many of these scholars, as Professor Sorensen, his PowerPoint contained it, but he didn't mention it, were Peace Corps volunteers. Professor Seung-Kyung Lee in Indiana did some wonderful work on the Peace Corps volunteers and the foundation of Korean studies in North America some time ago. I think that experience, that historical experience, has something to do with what Professor Sorensen called the critical yet sympathetic orientation. It's a key difference that I think we should celebrate, that first, the founding fathers of the field in many ways were not OSS intelligence officers, but people who had peace on their mind, who were coming to Korea with a kind of critical understanding of America's role in Asia, especially in the wake of the Vietnam War. They also had, I think, an ambiguous relationship to the South Korean government because they came and in many ways they were recipients of the largesse of the Korean government across different decades, but much of their scholarship contributed to making the world understand the costs of development as well as the prize of development, and especially the problems associated with authoritarianism. I will now move on to Professor Jisu Kim's presentation, where I drew the keyword of diversity. For the 782 generation, one of the key features that marked their sense of shared time was lack. They came to Korea at a time when Korea was utterly impoverished. Korean studies that they helped found was resource poor. Many of them had no prospects of landing a stable job after spending years upon years of training in Korean studies. And when they did find jobs, sometimes in East Asian studies departments, Korea was, as Professor Lee Eun-jung mentioned, in a Howie category in East Asia, a third wheel in places where China and Japan had much more established history of scholarship and research. For me, however, this lack and the fact that Korean studies came to area studies in North America in somewhat belated fashion opens up opportunities rather than creates liabilities. It gives a certain kind of ethical character to Korean studies. The ambiguous relationship with the US government gives Korean studies as area studies a quality that I think is distinctly missing in the more well-developed, established Japanese studies and Chinese studies in some respects. And there is a link to diversity. Because of this character, because of this history, I think Korean studies has an appeal in North America to students, even to students who might not understand that their appeal, the reason why they're drawn to Korean studies is built upon that history. So many of our students that we teach in our classrooms now are students who come from minority backgrounds, ethnically, racially, also sexual positions, minorities. They find in Korean studies something liberating, and it's not just in K-pop and K-culture that they find that kind of liberation. They find something extremely dynamic and cutting edge and liberating in the history of Korea over the painful 20th century, in the history of democratization, in the continuing innovation and dynamism that even phenomena like Hell Joseon ends up creating. So I think that's something that we can embrace. And institutions, funding agencies, universities can be very purposive and intentional about fostering. So to the extent that academia should also be an equitable place, a just place, and diversity creates a better, richer scholarship for everybody involved, it's something that needs, I think, intentional and long-term investment. So how can Korean studies be really a model for diversity and equity and inclusion? There, I'm thinking about what Professor Han in the earlier speech mentioned, 규범 창출, and what Professor Lee in her paper mentioned as Korea as method. Some conversations, some real deep soul searching, and some desire on the part of the funding agencies to make investments that are not immediately legible as returns within a grant cycle. I think these are the kinds of things that are needed. Finally, it's really, I agree with everyone that Korean studies has gone from rags to riches in record time. And the kind of sense of lack that the 782 generation had, I certainly don't wish on myself or on any of my students. However, I think there's something to be said about what's lost when we go from a place filled with scholars who have existential reason to pursue scholarly work in a field that they don't expect to be rewarded in any way, to a field where there are lots and lots, well, I shouldn't say lots and lots, but a lot more opportunities, and it becomes easier to think of Korean studies as a means to an end rather than an end in and of itself. So that's something that I'd like perhaps for us to talk about later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll certainly continue that discussion on diversity issues and generation issues and what you said, the quote-unquote lack, the concept of lack. How do we translate that into something different? Next discussant is Professor Robert Oppenheim.
Okay, is this on? Good. Well, let me start by echoing a lot of other people here and expressing my thanks first of all to the Korea Foundation for this event, and then also to the panelists, the presenters who spoke before, Professor Kim for moderating. Certainly my own university, not to repeat the story, right? Certainly my own university, the University of Texas, is one where our two tenure track positions in Korean studies, albeit in different ways, are both thanks to the Korea Foundation in one way or another. So again, thank you for that. Like Professor Yu, perhaps I don't know exactly where to begin. I don't quite have keywords. That was good, but let me just kind of pick out a couple of points from the various presentations. First, yes, I appreciate Professor Kim's, Jisu Kim's discussion, although it was also in Clark's paper. Of diversity and inclusion. And like a lot of people, I think that's, I kind of fundamentally see that as a happy story. When I was taking Korean, there tended not to be very many people who were not ethnically Korean in my Korean language classes. That certainly has shifted completely. Korean language classes at my university have good enrollment. They have a wide variety of people. When I teach, my fundamental Korean studies course, kind of the largest single group is actually Vietnamese students, Vietnamese American students in my class. And sometimes I joke perhaps because there's no Vietnam Foundation. So that's all great. And I mean, I think there is a wider variety of people who are interested in Korea, certainly in North America. And, to the extent that part of what we're doing is trying to kind of, broaden interest in Korean studies, I think that's excellent. I become a little bit, I think a lot of my comments are going to be two-sided, good news, bad news, pessimism, optimism. I become a little worried that, at the PhD level that we're also still concerned about, there's kind of an increasing concern in North America that, the precariousness, the opportunity cost, the risk of doing a PhD and attempting to make a career out of that is increasingly something that, is exclusionary. It excludes people who don't have a certain amount of social capital, economic capital, and the like. And I think that there's, no way that Korean studies can escape that. So I still, at the PhD level, that's still perhaps a concern. I was taken by, shifting topic, I was taken by Clark's comments about kind of the foundationalism of kind of studies of Korea during the 782 era, or whatever we want to call it. I guess there's another part to the story in that, certainly in our field, in anthropology, it's not only a story of Korean studies becoming less oriented towards foundational research, it's also a story of anthropology itself having kind of made that turn of moving away from, kind of foundational, the X sort of studies. I mean, when there's an old anthropology of Korea called, Cornelius Osgood, The Koreans and Their Culture, right? Nobody would write that anymore. But nobody would write that, but nobody would write, the Germans and their culture either, right? So, to some degree, anthropology itself, and maybe other social science disciplines, have made that change. And so I guess I wonder whether the question is, what happens when the foundationalism of an area studies field is kind of out of sync with the disciplines. And maybe a secondary question, for kind of a global Korean studies is, how do you create foundational knowledge? Do you need to create new foundational knowledge in every language, in every national situation in which Korean studies may come into being? And how do you do that, depending on whether the fields in which you're operating are themselves amenable to kind of foundational studies? So that. I was also taken with the various comments on area studies, or Jiokak, as was described by Professor Min. And of course, yes, in the United States we have the story of kind of Cold War area studies. In Europe, we have the story of kind of Korea's insertion into things like universal history and philology, although, perhaps there was more of a tendency to look to South Asia there. And that's, it's more complex than that. There was philology in the United States, et cetera. But I guess I also wonder whether there are new formations of area studies. I guess I wonder if there's anything new. If there are new formations of area studies or regional studies or Jiokak that are coming into being, and perhaps, particularly in a place, in a place like Latin America or Central and South America. Whether there's a convergence with, something new. I mean, we have new formations like, Pacific studies and other sorts of regional studies that are like that. The dialectic used to be one of national studies versus globalization, right? But now we have a situation in which, the transnational studies are increasingly being placed, right? They're increasingly being given kind of a territorial basis. They're increasingly being, located somewhere. And I guess I'm wondering where kind of Korean studies is going to fit into that. And again, I think it could fit into those new, I don't want to say area studies, but not area independent kinds of kinds of knowledge in some interesting ways. Finally, on orchid disciplines from Professor Ian Jung's talk. I love the phrase, I mean, because, orchids, hothouse flowers, that kind of worry that one has. I have a particularly, I'm not very good with plants. I have a particularly black thumb, okay? But on the other hand, people tell me that orchids are tougher than you think, right? And that, in fact, what you want to do with an orchid is anyway, treat it with a certain amount of discipline. This question of orchid disciplines, I mean, I guess, I think we need to become, as the old anthropologists were, scholars of kind of the informal politics of universities. In my university, certainly, yes, there is an emphasis on STEM. There is sometimes an administrative interest in butts and seats, as the infelicitous phrase goes. But there's also kind of ways in which the administration responds to kind of a prestige economy of scholarship. And, anyway, informal politics, I mean, the question for me is kind of what stabilizes positions in something like Korean studies, what's going to keep it going in the future. Again, certainly where I am, the rhetoric is that there is no such thing as lines anymore, right? We don't have lines. Lines don't just continue to exist. But what does exist are kind of, networks of interest and something like South Asian studies at my university has been stabilized because of just a kind of an ongoing repetitive network of interest. And so, I mean, I think, unfortunately, as Professor Duncan said earlier, that means that there's no easy answer to how to keep Korean studies going. Anyway, that's the kind of the genre of question I think we need to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Oppenheim. The precarity part that you talked about, PhDs produced at least in the US at this point, we are facing tremendously difficult time. And we produce our PhDs, where do they go? In academia these days, plan B is no longer plan B. And everyone has to be prepared for something else other than academia. So I hope we have a chance to discuss this after, again, the presentations. So next discussant is Professor Miriam, let me see, there was the, okay. Yeah, Lovensteinova, yes. Thank you.
It works. Thank you very much, and I will add some notes to the previous speakers as they touched the most important themes. And it taught us many about the history and traditions of their own Korean studies. So not many things remain, but my remarks will be very personal and concern European tradition and some keywords from their talks. They talks also imply other topic, the importance of personalities who establish Korean studies, because they not only establish Korean studies at universities, but also form their orientation. As to the Europe, we have a very important phenomenon. This was immigration in 1940s, and the research interest and activities of the local Koreans influenced every old Korean studies. As for example, in Prague, Korean language was taught during the World War II because we have our Korean, yeah? So the information, it's warning. Sorry, yeah. The information about Korea were disseminated to several channels and in the form of newspapers, journals, and books, etc. And what was typical also, these forefathers, these local Koreans, were influenced by the local intellectuals. for example, also Central and Eastern Europe has a long philological tradition, not only about teaching language, but also literature. But it wasn't very strong in the anthropology, social science, and philosophy. And the other Europe, the forefathers of Korean studies defined their Korean studies in 1950s and 60s. And the old centers remained, still possess their characteristics from the beginning, if this tradition wasn't interrupted. The program of every Korean studies was also connected with the domestic ways of things and perception of every foreign culture. Also in the late Eastern Europe, we have the long tradition of translation, as well as a special tradition of literature or perception, a theoretical approach to language and literature that began in the Russian formalism and then Prague linguistic circle that influenced all the research of language and literature. This later forms the French structuralism. This is our Korean program, studies programs were established following this tradition. So we can speak about generation, but what I would like to add, not every generation faced the experience of Republic of Korea. So we in the Eastern Europe have to follow the opportunities DPRK gave us to us here. So I don't know if we have to discuss the question of what is Korean studies, because we discuss it last 20 years every session we have. In 2005 we have a special session in AKS at AKS, and the result is very vague. So Korean studies were defined at that time not only by the topics, but Korean studies are discipline based on Korean as a primary source. But this diversity is everywhere by them. So I will turn to today's state. I think it is fascinating in Europe when looking back. During the last 20 years, I had the opportunity to observe many new Korean studies. Some of them developed in a very quick way and became the important centers of today with a great potential. This is the case of Berlin, for example, and also the case of Copenhagen. What is new, that students have many opportunities to study in Korea, and Korean language, as well as the topic of Korea, is not something rare or special. However, it is not our ultimate goal. I think in Europe, because I cannot say I understand the other part of what, there will also be bigger centers of Korean studies and small centers. Some of the newly established Korean studies will vanish without the support of Korean institution, or after the Korean wave will coming to end. Also, what is also changing, there is the content of Korean studies. As we can see during the last AXE conferences, where culture studies, gender studies, and North Korean studies represent a great part of the presentations. I think the interest for today fashionable topics will vanish, for sure, and will be replaced by another fashionable topics. But what I would like to stress, these topics can be studied in an academic way, so as a part of social studies, but with a firm basis on in theory and methodology. Nevertheless, I'm an advocate of the classical discipline, history, literature, and language, so linguistic, but in a new theoretical frame, that can be interconnected with other disciplines, for example, social studies. Yeah, I think the old discipline has to be preserved because they have the potential for the future. And because of these themes, Korean scholars ask us for cooperation. So, so I'm pleased every time when reading a monograph on such themes as I hold history, literature, and linguistics. So that's, I think this is something we need in Europe because this cooperation is possible. But not many books, essential books were made up to date. So I have 1 minute left. So I would like to, you have to celebrate, for example, before all, the anniversary of Korea Foundation that helped, I think, not only in Europe, but in Europe substantially, several projects for personal grants. It supports the young scholars and university teachers. I'm extremely thankful to Korea Foundation in my role as a university teacher and supervisor of the young scholars. They are supported by Korea Foundation, but also in my role of researcher because I was granted by them from the beginning of the Korea Foundation existence. My first project was in 1992. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Levenstrainova, for bringing again another perspective from within Europe, from Eastern Europe perspective to bring our attention to that. Our final discussant is Professor Antonio Fiori.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, I would like to express my gratitude to the Korea Foundation for the invitation, to my colleagues for their presentations. After the presentation Professor Yoon Dong made about the condition of Korean studies in Europe, now it's the turn actually to talk about the underdeveloped Europe when it comes to Korean studies. So actually that's why I'm here. The first thing that actually I would like to say about the presentations today is that, and this is positive, of course, actually all panelists here testified to a certain degree that actually Korean studies are developing in all continents, continuously growing, and of course this is true for Europe as well. It seems like the gap between Korean studies and other countries' studies like Japan or China is eventually being filled to some extent. And of course this means that the number of students interested in Korean studies is continuously growing. And of course, this is good. This is pretty much positive. But, this has also some shades. It brings some shades into the big picture that Professor Sorensen actually talked about. The fact that if we have more and more students, this basically means that we need to have more and more faculty members teaching Korean studies or different aspects of Korean studies. And at the very end, actually, I hope I will have 20 seconds to ask you and actually to open kind of reflection on what Korean studies means because in some universities, in some continents, in some nations actually, I don't think we can talk about Korean studies. At least in my country actually, there's no Korean studies for a few reasons that I will try to make clear in a minute. But of course, actually, students, faculty members, but of course, recruiting more faculty members is quite difficult. And it is quite difficult because actually we need to come to terms with financial limitations. Financial problems that many universities actually are experiencing, at least in the European continent. Actually, many universities are experiencing these kind of problems, and it is very easy to, as Professor Duncan actually mentioned about what is happening in States, it is very easy in Europe too to, see positions disappearing and never reappearing. And this brings me actually probably to the most important point that I would like to raise. That is, what is Korean studies? And actually I can bring you the experience, the Italian experience, or, the experience of some universities in Italy. That is, even though actually I like to think at myself as somebody who does research on Korea. I am a political scientist, by the way. Nobody's perfect. But actually, my research is focused on Korea. Actually, I would say both Koreas, inter-Korean relations, which is better. I actually need to think of me as a political scientist, because actually my university wants me to think of myself as a political scientist, because there's no Korean studies, in the overall picture of my university, and I don't think there's any in the Italian academia. Actually, we have Chinese language specialists, we have actually Japanese language specialists, and when it comes to Korea, we do not have any kind of group that actually is focused exclusively on Korea or Korean language or Korean studies. So, actually, this is a kind of problem for us. And, basically, it is very important for me. This is very important for me because actually, at least in the past, some specialists in Korean studies had a kind of, how to say, I would use this word actually, forgive me, have had this kind of snobbish attitude towards people who were not doing, who were not kind of mainstream Korean studies specialists, eventually excluding those who had, who came or became interested in Korea coming from other disciplines. I think this is quite important, and I think that actually, as somebody was highlighting, I think that actually this is important. Accepting people from other disciplines is pretty much important in order to, revamp and eventually develop Korean studies. And then, actually, I read all the papers, all the presentations. They were actually very nice. In some presentations, in Professor Kim's presentation, for example, even though you had no time to highlight it, but actually she wondered about Hallyu and the consequences of Hallyu, and this is quite important. Actually, we launched in my university. My university is very big, by the way. It's one of the biggest universities, beyond being the oldest university in the world, actually is, or we actually like to say so. We are not sure if, it eventually was really established in 1088, but we are very proud of that. It's kind of, on top of that, actually, we have 90,000 students. So this makes the University of Bologna one of the biggest universities in Europe, for sure. Actually, we launched Korean language last year, and we were expecting something like 15 students. All of a sudden, we had 115 students. And Hallyu has a role in it. I think it has a role in it. And actually, we need to come to terms with Hallyu. I don't like BTS, actually, but if students actually like them, I mean, I have no problems with that. Now, of course, we need, to understand actually how threatening Hallyu can be in the long run. I mean, once actually this production, this cultural production is over, what will happen to Korean studies after so many students have been attracted by Hallyu? But we will eventually come to terms with that when it will be the moment. And then the Korea Foundation, and then I will end, only 25 seconds actually. The Korea Foundation is extremely important for the development of Korean studies in the world. Other organizations, Professor Duncan actually was mentioning them in his speech, but the Korea Foundation is, according to me, the real important organization for the promotion and the development of Korean studies in the world. In Europe, actually, it has been quite important. There would not be any Korean studies specialists. At my university, we are 3 now, but actually at my university, there would be none without the intervention of the Korea Foundation. In Italy, we say that actually the one who feeds you is your father, and so that's why I can consider President Igun as my father today. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for presenters and discussants. We have about 20 minutes left for us to discuss a little bit, and I would also like to give our audience, of course, enough time to ask us any questions that you may have. So I want to use probably about 10 minutes for us, and then 10 minutes for the audience. It is not that often that we sit on the same platform to discuss these issues. So I would like to ask presenters and the speakers to raise any issues that you thought we should further, within 10-minute limit, of course, to discuss among ourselves, or any comments that you would like to raise for those of us who are sitting right here. So anybody who wants to raise your hand, you can go ahead.
Okay, I'll start off by saying something. I was intrigued by Professor Fiori's remark about Hallyu, because this is something that we also deal with at our university, that there's a huge interest in Korean language and literature, and it's motivated by anime, movies, but mostly by K-pop. And when I said, why? Well, it's because they're young and sexy, aren't they? And so I don't object to that, but there may be a price to pay because once you start with K-pop, where do you go with it? And it's not something that personally interested me. I actually got in trouble once when I said that at a conference in Seattle, and the reporter for the Chunghang Ilbo was there. And I said that I didn't like K-pop, and he was mortally offended. And he made me apologize to him, so I finally said, 유감스러운 말이었지. So that's kind of how it goes. So, but I wonder what the future of the field is if we were attracting all of these young people, and it's great to have our classes full and everything. I used to teach a little section on K-pop until I realized the students know more about it than I do. So then I stopped. But anyway, I think it's an important question.
저희 같은 경우에 지금 이게 K-pop 유행이
So this popularity of K-pop, you can see that the hype is less in Europe. We believe that the hype is less in Europe than the US. But if you look at the freshmen, and if we conduct a survey, in many cases, they started to gain interest in Korea due to K-pop, and they wanted to learn more about Korea and decided to enroll in the course. But if we look at them in working on their graduation dissertations, out of the 36 students, there are only 3 students that are actually writing their paper on K-pop. So only 3. So you can see that as they do harness their expertise in Korean studies, they find different aspects and dimensions of Korea. And K-pop can be the gateway to their interest in Korea, but then it's about what happens next. In studying Korea and in Korean studies, it's about what we can actually provide them with, the new opportunities into the Korean discipline. And I also do agree, many people talk about Hallyu, but I think that K-pop is the only gateway into Korean studies. That's a risky statement and an approach.
And many people ask me how K-pop can continue popularity in Latin America, but we cannot guarantee that because it all depends on the fans. And in Latin America, I don't think you should be too obsessed with Korean studies or Korean studies as scholars, because there are many different fields where we can find talents and develop talents to contribute to society. And that's what Korean studies should do.
Just said. So K-pop or K-culture, I think, is really the beginning. It's what sparks students' interest in Korea. And recently, we see many students coming into college learning Korean independently, not necessarily in their high school, but because they have interest in K-pop. They want to learn lyrics, and so they study. And then they come to college, they take Korean language classes, but they're not all just interested about K-pop. And I think our role at higher education is how to really encourage these students to pursue their interest in studying about Korea. I don't want to necessarily say Korean studies, because they're not all going to be academics, as we've been saying. They really, they're going to be entering into a variety of different professional fields. And we are educating these undergrads, not just students who are interested in becoming scholars. And so in that sense, I think it's really, and also when we look at our students in our undergraduate research fellows program, and we read their statement of purpose, and most of the time, they are drawn because of Korean culture, but also their friends who, they learn about Korean families, and they're about religious practices, and so it's all sorts of variety of different reasons. And I would just want to, what I wanted to talk about Hallyu, optimism versus danger, was actually, I was going to refer to Professor Seung Kim's recent article that she wrote about. Hallyu, part of it is really state-driven project, and this is, and we have to be careful. Professor Yoon Jung talked about self-criticism, but I think we should really try to escape and avoid self-orientalism, orientalist discourse when we are talking about Hallyu. And so I think, it's really, Hallyu is definitely, it has huge impact in really sparking interest among students in starting Korean studies. But I think our job is not really about them learning more about Korean limited Korean culture, but really more broadly expand their interest in learning about Korea. And as Professor Yoon-jun mentioned, many of our students writing papers, they were interested in Korean culture, but they end up writing about issues about inter-Korean relations, South Korean economic development, democratization. There's such a variety of different topics that students are interested in, and I think it's really important how we encourage these students to pursue that kind of interest and kind of really build their knowledge.
So we have 3 more people.
지금 저희가 교육적으로
Yeah, so as educational scholars and as professors of Korean studies, I think that was the perspective that I've just mentioned, but I want to talk about as a perspective of a scholar. So in Europe, there is this discipline of Korean studies, but the Korea Foundation and the growth of Korean studies have greatly contributed, supported this endeavor, and we've thanked KF. But I think that going forward, it's now about Korean government and the Korean Foundation. If we have no longer such support from these government agencies, how can we contain and sustain Korean studies? I still have never been supported by the Korea Foundation, and that's not, of course, the reason why I do not have any gratitude towards the Korean Foundation. But I do want to mention that beyond this framework of public diplomacy, how can Korean studies in the respective nations grow as a discipline? I think this is something that we also have to look into. So in my paper, that's why I've mentioned Korea as a method. And also, Korean scholars and researchers and Korean studies, what kind of relationship should be in place between the two was something that I hope that we could discuss. And this is such an invaluable venue. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, and I think I really cannot go into the gist that I really wanted to share with all of you. But Korean studies as the area studies of 21st century is of course different from the 20th century US area studies and the 19th century European area studies that branched out from Japanese studies. And now in the 21st century, Korean studies actually have to do with scholars that grew up in Korea and going out abroad and telling their story. So then considering that, what kind of area studies discipline should Korean studies should be? I think this is something that we really need to put in some more serious thought into.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the K-pop question briefly and say something in defense of K-pop. Not that K-pop needs my defense. While I agree that we would all want to diversify the kinds of research that our students do, and the K-pop does a fantastic job of serving as a gateway. I do want to say that K-pop does not exist. It's not some freakishly strange thing that exists independently of Korean history, of Korean culture, Korean society. That in K-pop, we find all of those things. In many ways, it's a 결정체 of that process. So I don't want to necessarily say that K-pop is some less serious aspect of or a kind of a gateway drug that gets our students into Korea, and then they can go on to more serious topics. I think that view also has its own danger.
Thank you. Professor Lobenstreifen, and you will have the last word.
So we have the different tradition, but I also know that K-pop influenced the interest for Korean studies. We have the entrance exam because of the great interest, and it was spread. It is funny that we don't accept any person who will speak about the interest in K-pop. Yeah, so during the exams, everyone pretends to be scholarly oriented and a great reader of Korean literature, etc. So, of course, they are secret K-pop gamers, yeah. But they have to do something more, yeah. And our lecturer taught us every time that our students came to the Charles University as K-popers, and they are turned into the prospective academician. So that's all. So it's our task here. So the interest, turn the interest another way.
Thank you so much. So we have 7.5 minutes now. I think we can entertain 2 questions. And yes. The microphone, please.
감사합니다. 상페테르부르크 국립대학교 쿠르바노.
I am Corvano from St. Peter's University. I would like to raise one issue. Professor Kim Jisu has mentioned an important issue of terminology. Yes, what does Korean studies mean? But I beg to differ on one point. In Korea, there is North Korean studies, but there is no South Korean studies. There's the national studies, meaning studying your own nation. In English, it is Department of Korean Language and Literature, and it is a discipline of looking at with a different perspective and a point of view. So the biggest issue as a Korean scholar, Korean studies scholar, is the lack of relations between Korean studies and national studies. Almost no one writes an article on Korean studies here in Korea. There's no Korean studies scholars represented in South Korea. So what I would like to request to KF is that along with the overseas scholars and their history, culture, and literature scholars here in Korea, please help us build a network, because Korea, we need the primary sources, and we ask for resources and we just copy the resources and nothing else. But in Korea, if you look at those who are interested in studies abroad, you will have many interesting points that you can refer to. We can have a different assessment of Korean studies and look at the culture and history of Korea from a different perspective. We can help you gain that new perspective. And so going forward, to further progress Korean studies, national studies and Korean studies abroad need to build a relationship. With the support of KF, I hope that overseas scholars and Korean national scholars could have a joint conference. Thank you.
And I think you brought up a really important issue here. And that conversation may not be that easy. And it will be very uncomfortable for many people to have honest conversation between those of us who study Korean studies outside and, like you just mentioned, 국학, 한국사, 한국문학. Those kinds of conversations that need to happen. And some of us have been talking about a possibility of providing the venue for having these conversations. But immediately you may remember, for those scholars, again, what medium do we use? Do we use Korean? Do we use English? Do we use what? Those issues right away coming up. But nonetheless, I really appreciate that you brought that up, and we need to think about that in some ways with Korea Foundation's help and others, and all of us should participate in having that conversation for the future. Thank you. We can have another question. Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much for pointing that out. So I just want to quickly respond in saying that I think in Korea, when they use 한국학, I think it is really referring to more broadly, targeting towards overseas 한국학. But of course, in Korea, we know there's, especially at the college, university levels, there's 국학. And also some institutions like Yonsei, it's 국학연구원, not 한국학연구원. But Seoul대 has 규정각 한국학연구원. And so I think even within Korea, I mean, there are some differences that we see at different universities. And I just want to kind of, I mean, when we talk about Korean studies, we understand generally what we mean in English. And then also in Korean, when we say 한국학, of course, within 한국학 here in Korea, I mean, for domestic audiences, there's 국학 and also 북한학. And so there are these differences. But I just wanted to kind of, raise that issue. As I said in my presentation, I mean, I don't have an answer. Maybe there's no answer, but it's just something to think about.
Okay, there's a person over there, and this will be the last question. Sorry about that.
Good morning. I wanted to thank you all for your insight and your knowledge, especially by region. That was very intriguing to me as a student. My name is Kai Struther. I'm a rising junior English major at Spelman College here with George Washington. And my question today is for Dr. Sorensen. Hearing now in 2022 that you got your PhD in the 1970s, now we can see how many historical events have happened since then. And my question today is, what were some of the difficulties you've experienced attempting to keep up with relations and relationships that were constantly changing during a time where resources weren't readily available, with discourse that was still developing? And by relationships, I mean within the United States and within the Koreas as well. Thank you.
That's a really big question. I've just finished a manuscript that's like 125,000 words that talks about this issue, because what you kind of asked is what happened is that the historical structures in which Korean studies developed has changed over time, and the kind of relationships you have, the funding sources have changed. In the United States, we're fortunate that we've had academic organizations such as the Association for Asian Studies, American Anthropological Association, and so forth, where those of us who have studied Korea can meet with a nationwide audience and kind of network that way. Some of our Korean colleagues got their degrees in the United States and went back, but they come to that meeting. A very few of us have been able to attend the Hanguk Ilhake meeting, that is the Korean Anthropological Society meeting. I've been to it once, I think. It's very, very difficult to get the funding to fly over the Pacific in order to attend a meeting. But it's getting easier. I once looked up the fare of my first plane trip to East Asia, and it was $2,200. This was in 1972. And so I went on the internet and I asked, well, what's $2,200 in current dollars? And so you'll click and it came back and it was $20,000. And that reminds me that in those days, you couldn't come to the Far East as it was without foundation support. It was just too expensive for an individual person to be able to pay for that plane ticket. And now that's not the case. I mean, I got a PhD in Korea, and I'm an anthropologist, so I went to do field work in Korea. I jumped off the plane in 1976. It was Chuseok, and I was going to do field work. It was my first visit ever to Korea, and that's not something you would see today. That people who have a PhD, a lot of them have been to Korea for long periods of time before they even start their program. Many of them study language here. And so actually interaction across the Pacific is easier now than it used to be, but it's still pretty hard.
Okay, with this, we will have to wrap up this session. I would like to thank the presenters, and I would like to thank the audience for your active listening and participation. Thank you, everyone.